What if unlimited wealth was never invented by the oil tycoons at all? What if the blueprint for infinite capital, influence, and near total economic control was engineered long before the first barrel of oil was ever pumped from the ground? This is the question history avoids, the one that exposes how power truly works beneath the surface. Because before Rockefeller, before Carnegie, before the industrial empires that textbooks love to glorify, there was a family that cracked a far more dangerous code, the ability to turn a global instability, trade imbalances, and geopolitical blind spots into a fountain of endless profit. Most people think wealth comes from resources, from innovation, from luck, or from being in the right place at the right time. But the truth is colder and far more revealing. Real, generational, unshakable wealth comes from understanding patterns that nations themselves fail to see. Patterns hidden in collapsing empires, shifting currencies, and the pressure points of global trade. And the family we are about to uncover mastered those patterns with a precision that would make modern billionaires look like amateurs. They didn't just accumulate money. They engineered systems that produced it on command. Imagine operating in a world where governments were desperate, markets were fragile, and empires were stretched beyond their limits. Now imagine being the one who supplied what everyone needed, but no one could publicly acknowledge. That is the kind of power that rewrites economies, shapes wars, and turns private families into silent architects of global history. And the most unsettling part is this. The mechanisms they created did not disappear. They evolved, they spread, and they quietly influenced the financial world we live in today. As we step into this story, ask yourself something. Have you ever felt like certain players always win, no matter the crisis, no matter the collapse, no matter how the rules change? That sense of inevitability is not an illusion. It is the legacy of a system built long before oil fortunes existed. A system this family used to generate unlimited wealth while remaining almost invisible. And as we unravel how they did it, you might notice echoes in today's financial structures, echoes that reveal just how little has really changed. Before we continue, share your own perspective. Have you ever wondered who truly profits during global instability? Leave a comment, make sure to hit the like button, and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. Because understanding this story is the key to understanding the world you live in. And what comes now will take this deeper without breaking the flow. Before the world worshipped oil barons as the architects of modern wealth, the global economy ran on something far more volatile: imbalance. Trade routes stretched across continents, empires rose and fell on the strength of their currencies, and the flow of silver, gold, and essential commodities dictated the rhythm of power. This was a world where governments were constantly calculating, constantly maneuvering, and constantly desperate to maintain stability they could never fully control. And it was within this instability that the earliest creators of unlimited wealth found their opening. Long before pipelines, refineries, and corporate monopolies, the true engines of fortune were oceans, ports, and political blind spots. A single disrupted route could bankrupt a nation. A shift in demand could tilt the global balance. A famine, a war, a trade blockade. Even a royal marriage could realign entire economies overnight. Most merchants merely reacted to these changes, scrambling to adapt. But a select few learned to anticipate them, to study the implosion points of empires and position themselves exactly where pressure would build. This was the difference between wealth and dominance. And while ordinary traders focused on commodities, this family focused on leverage. They understood something the world had not yet articulated. When nations are vulnerable, intermediaries become indispensable. They realized that capital, information, and mobility were worth more than any single product. By operating between empires rather than inside them, they avoided the limits, taxes, and political traps that constrained everyone else. While rulers fought over territory, they quietly built networks that transcended borders. While governments obsessed over gold, reserves, they built systems that generated wealth without needing to touch a mine. The pre-oil economy was a battlefield disguised as a marketplace. European empires competed for dominance in Asia, the Middle East, and the Americas, draining their treasuries faster than they could replenish them. Asian powers attempted to shield themselves from foreign influence, not realizing that economic infiltration often succeeded where armies failed. And beneath all of this, currency systems were cracking under the pressure of overextension and debt. The family we are following watched these cracks form and understood what they meant before anyone else. They saw that when a nation becomes dependent on a resource, a route, or a financial mechanism, the real power belongs not to the nation, but to the one who quietly controls that dependency. So while kings, emperors, and ministers fought their visible battles, this family played the invisible game. They learned how to exploit mismatches between supply and demand, how to position themselves where regulation was weakest, and how to turn every geopolitical shift into an opportunity rather than a threat. The world before oil may seem distant, but its dynamics created the perfect environment for a family capable of reading patterns and anticipating collapse. It was a world of scarcity, imbalance, and restless expansion, and in that chaos, they discovered the formula for unlimited wealth that would shape everything that followed, setting the stage for the empire they were about to build. What makes a dynasty different from a wealthy family is not the scale of its riches, but the structure behind them. Most fortunes rise and fall within a generation because they depend on a product, a territory, or a favorable circumstance. But the dynasty at the center of this story built something far more durable. Their wealth did not depend on the lifespan of a resource or the goodwill of an empire. It was engineered, layer by layer, through a design that turned volatility into reliability and geopolitical fractures into the foundation of an empire. They began not with vast capital, but with something more potent, a network. In an age when contracts could be broken with impunity and legal systems were fragile, trust was currency. And this family possessed a web of trusted contacts stretching across borders, cultures, and political systems. Their lineage gave them access to merchants, financiers, and officials who rarely collaborated with outsiders. These early bonds became the scaffolding on which their future wealth would rise. But networks alone did not build their empire. What set them apart was their ability to read the global landscape with brutal clarity. While many traders chased profit through volume, this family chased influence. They recognized that the most valuable position in any system is the one that others depend on but cannot replace. So they sought out gaps in global trade where demand was high, supply was fragile, and governments lacked the reach or agility to act effectively. In those spaces, profit was not just possible, it was inevitable. Their ascent accelerated when they realized something few others understood. Controlling the flow of information was as profitable as controlling the flow of goods. They built channels for intelligence that moved faster than official dispatches, faster than government couriers, even faster than military communications. Merchants, diplomats, soldiers, and local power brokers fed them data about prices, shortages, conflicts, and policy shifts. And with that information, they could predict movements in the global economy with uncanny precision. This allowed them to act not as merchants, but as architects. They financed production before governments realized shortages were coming. They positioned ships and agents in ports that others still considered unremarkable. They negotiated deals that seemed insignificant at the time but became priceless months later when empires found themselves cornered by circumstances. Everything they touched was designed to compound, to expand, to anchor them deeper into the arteries of global commerce. Their wealth did not grow in straight lines or predictable increments. It expanded through sudden surges triggered by crises that paralyzed others but enriched them, and each surge strengthened their ability to shape the very conditions that produced the next opportunity. By the time the world began to notice their influence, their fortune was no longer just money. It was a structure, disciplined and self-reinforcing, built from foresight, leverage, information, and adaptability, a structure that could withstand wars, collapses, and the rise and fall of empires without losing momentum, because it was designed to thrive where others faltered. What truly separated this family from every other merchant house of their era was not their courage, their connections, or even their strategic intelligence, but a mechanism they quietly built that functioned like a financial engine long before the modern world had a name for it. While most traders relied on the simple equation of buying and selling goods, this family learned to operate in a different dimension, where profit came not from the goods themselves, but from controlling the conditions under which everyone else traded. Their breakthrough began when they recognized a flaw in global commerce. Empires were constantly fighting. Wars they could not afford, enforcing laws they could not uphold, and protecting trade routes they could not fully control. Governments were overextended, treasuries strained, and bureaucracies slow. That vacuum created an opening for anyone agile enough to step in. This family understood that filling those gaps meant they could dictate prices, timing, and access in ways that no empire could challenge directly. They stopped viewing themselves as merchants and started functioning as the unofficial infrastructure of global trade. They eliminated the limitations that trapped ordinary traders. Instead of depending on fluctuating supply, they financed production upstream. Instead of waiting for markets to shift, they manipulated the flow of goods through timing and placement. Instead of being trapped by borders, they built networks that bypassed political restrictions entirely. They became the silent force smoothing frictions between empires, solving problems governments could not address quickly enough and charging a premium for it. Every inefficiency in the system became a source of profit. But their true innovation was the use of leverage before the concept formally existed. They discovered they could use promised goods, future shipments, or even anticipated shortages as collateral to obtain capital that did not yet exist. This allowed them to cycle money through multiple layers of trade simultaneously. A single unit of capital could be in motion in 3 or 4 regions at once, each transaction generating returns that compounded on the next. It was not merely trade, it was multiplication. This expanding engine became self-perpetuating. The more influence they gained, the more governments depended on them. The more governments depended on them, the more they could negotiate terms that elevated their position above competitors. And the higher their position rose, the easier it became to shape markets subtly rather than react to them. They built a financial organism that did not require stability to grow. It thrived on volatility. Wars, embargoes, currency devaluations, and collapsing regimes were not threats. They were accelerants. By the time other merchant families realized what was happening, the structure was already too strong to replicate. The mechanism produced wealth not just from trade, but from the gaps, contradictions, and crises embedded in the global economy. Their system functioned like a precursor to modern financial engineering, quietly generating what looked from the outside like unlimited money. If any part of this hidden architecture fascinates you or reminds you of modern financial systems, share your thoughts in the comments so we can explore the deeper implications together. As their mechanism matured into a self-reinforcing engine, something remarkable began to happen. The great empires of the world, the very powers that once dictated the rules of commerce, quietly drifted into dependence on this family's operations. It was not a formal alliance. No government would ever admit such vulnerability. But the reality was unmistakable. Without the logistical reach, financial fluidity, and intelligence networks this family controlled, entire sectors of imperial economies would have stalled, wars would have dragged on, supply chains would have collapsed, and crucial revenue streams would have evaporated. This dependence formed gradually. At first, governments saw the family as useful. Intermediaries, filling gaps the state could not address quickly enough. But usefulness soon transformed into necessity. When shortages emerged, the family was the only player capable of sourcing goods rapidly and discreetly. When diplomatic tensions disrupted trade, the family rerouted shipments around political barriers with ease. When empires needed liquidity, they extended credit faster than state banks. And because they operated across multiple jurisdictions, no single empire could contain or control them. What unsettled governments most was that the family's influence did not rely on military force or territorial claims. Their power was structural. They were embedded in the arteries of global commerce, providing essential functions that empires themselves had neglected. Every time a crisis hit, their importance became even more visible. That visibility provoked admiration and fear in equal measure. Empires knew they relied on the family, yet they also understood that such reliance created leverage the family rarely used overtly, but always possessed. Some ministers attempted to curtail their influence by imposing regulations or offering incentives to competing merchants, but competitors lacked the family's networks, speed, and adaptability. Others tried forming exclusive state monopolies, believing centralized control could outmaneuver a private dynasty. Instead, monopolies slowed trade further, unintentionally increasing the family's relevance. Even intelligence agencies struggled to keep pace with the communication channels the family had refined over generations. This dynamic fostered a silent tension. Officials whispered about the risks of allowing a private dynasty to hold so much sway over critical trade routes and financial flows. Yet the same officials depended on them to stabilize crises the state could not manage alone. It was a paradox embedded deep within the machinery of empire. They needed the family's power, but could never fully trust it. And the family understood this perfectly. They maintained a posture of cooperation, always appearing helpful, never overtly challenging imperial authority, while quietly expanding their strategic footprint. Their role became so integral that when wars erupted, the question was not whether empires would rely on them, but how heavily. Supply lines, naval logistics, financing, and even political negotiations were influenced by their involvement. The irony is that while empires projected the image of strength, the durability of their economies increasingly rested on a family that operated beyond their reach. This imbalance created a shadow dynamic that shaped decisions at the highest levels, revealing how the pursuit of unlimited wealth can entwine itself with the ambitions of nations until the two become nearly inseparable. As their influence deepened, the family's operations shifted from the visible world of commerce into the far more consequential realm of shadow, diplomacy. By the time most people even recognized their name, they were already embedded in the confidential negotiations, financial manipulations, and off-the-record agreements that shaped the trajectory of entire empires. Their role was never publicly acknowledged, yet leaders repeatedly depended on them to solve crises that official institutions were too slow, too rigid, or too compromised to handle. Their rise into this backstage world followed a simple truth. The more indispensable you become, the more access you gain. Ministers, governors, military commanders, and bureaucrats, many of whom clung to power through fragile alliances and unstable finances, learned that working with the family could stabilize their positions. A timely loan here, a discreet shipment there, a quiet introduction to a foreign financier, or a manipulated price that favored a struggling administration. All of these actions served as currency in covert political economies, and every favor created a debt, not always financial, but often strategic. This positioned the family at the intersection of politics and necessity. They did not need to bribe officials. Desperation did the work for them. Empires facing rebellion, famine, block trade, or military shortages would approach the family with requests that could never appear in public records. In exchange for assistance, the family secured privileges that bypassed standard regulation, reduced tariffs, exemptions from inspections, exclusive access to ports, or rights to operate in contested regions. These concessions, granted quietly and disguised as administrative exceptions, strengthened their hold over the global system. But the deeper layer of their influence was informational. Their network of agents, traders, financiers, sailors, and intermediaries captured intelligence far more valuable than any single cargo. They knew which nations were negotiating alliances, which markets were about to collapse, which military campaigns were failing, and which officials were secretly indebted. Governments often heard news from the family before they heard it from their own embassies. This imbalance gave the family a decisive advantage. They could anticipate shifts long before the political world reacted. At times, they even acted as unofficial diplomats. When empires could not speak openly due to political constraints, the family served as intermediaries, carrying messages, negotiating terms, or arranging covert exchanges. They could move between hostile governments without provoking scandal because they officially represented no flag, no ideology, no political agenda. Their only allegiance was to their own structure of power. This ambiguity unnerved statesmen. A family that operates above the geopolitical map is both an asset and a threat. Yet no empire could afford to sever ties with them. Each attempt to restrict their influence, whether through legislation or state monopolies, ended up reinforcing their position. Bureaucracies moved too slowly. Rival networks lacked reach. Corruption within governments inevitably found its way back to the family's advantage. By the time oil magnates appeared centuries later, the blueprint for manipulating global systems had already been perfected. It was here, in these unseen transactions and confidential negotiations, that the family transformed from wealthy merchants into architects of influence, shaping events not by force, but by understanding exactly where power fractures and how to slip through those cracks to reshape the world from behind the curtain. As their influence expanded, the world around them began to fracture in ways that were anything but accidental. The system they built thrived on instability, and instability always carries a price. Empires leaned on them to solve crises, but those same crises often deepened because of the very mechanisms that enriched the family. Their operations did not create chaos directly, rather, they accelerated the vulnerabilities already embedded in imperial structures. And once a nation became dependent on them, the smallest disruption in trade, finance, or diplomacy could trigger consequences far beyond anything the public understood. The family never needed to wield armies because the markets themselves became their battlefield. When a government's fiscal health depended on access to goods the family routed through selective ports, a temporary withdrawal could send inflation soaring. When an empire relied on their intelligence networks to anticipate shortages, a delayed report could push an already fragile region into famine. And when competing nations relied on their credit to fund military campaigns, it was the family, not any monarch, who decided which conflicts could continue and which would collapse under financial strain. This power was subtle yet overwhelming. A single adjustment in supply could tilt prices across continents. A redirected shipment could bankrupt a merchant class. A quiet extension of credit could prolong a war that would otherwise have ended months earlier. The family's pursuit of profit aligned seamlessly with the world's imbalances, creating cycles in which every major disruption, whether economic, political, or military, generated opportunities for them to expand their reach. But the cost for societies was immense. Regions once prosperous fell into dependency traps that lasted generations. Small kingdoms absorbed into imperial economies found themselves strangled by debts they never consented to. Local industries collapsed under the weight of foreign competition, engineered through the family's leverage. In some cases, entire populations became collateral damage as trade routes shifted, currencies destabilized, and political systems buckled under pressures no ruler fully understood. This pattern repeated itself across continents. A famine in one region strengthened their bargaining power in another. A war that devastated civilians created lucrative demand for logistical and financial services. A collapsing currency allowed them to acquire assets at a fraction of their value, only to resell them when stability returned. The family had no need to orchestrate these events. History did the work for them. They simply mastered the art of positioning themselves where every upheaval fed their engine of expansion. And yet, despite the destruction tied to their ascent, governments rarely blamed them. Official narratives pointed to weather, rivalry, corruption, or incompetence. The family remained invisible, their fingerprints hidden beneath layers of plausible necessity. They were indispensable, and so their role in the world's suffering went unnamed. But the consequences were permanent, shaping the fate of millions, while ensuring their own fortune remained not just intact, but ever-growing. If any part of this darker side of their influence raises questions or interpretations you believe are worth exploring further, share your thoughts in the comments so we can analyze the deeper layers together. By the time the family's influence peaked, the world had quietly absorbed their methods into its own political and economic machinery. What began as a private blueprint for manipulating trade, leverage, and information slowly evolved into the architecture of modern finance. Governments, banks, corporations, and international institutions adopted versions of the same mechanisms the family pioneered, often without. Realizing the origin of the system, they were now replicating. And because the family's strategies were rooted in fundamental human and geopolitical behavior, the framework survived long after their names faded from public memory. The most enduring part of their legacy was the concept of profit engineered from volatility rather than stability. They had demonstrated that markets do not collapse uniformly. They fracture along predictable lines. When currencies dip, when trade routes shift, when alliances crumble, when new technologies disrupt old hierarchies, someone stands to gain. The family built their empire by learning exactly where those fractures would occur. And today's financial world operates on the same logic. Traders, hedge funds, multinational corporations, and even central banks move capital not to avoid instability but to exploit it. Their second lasting influence was the normalization of interdependency as a tool of control. By embedding themselves into the most essential flows of commerce, they showed that true power comes from being unavoidable. Now, global supply chains function on the same principle. A disruption in one region can halt production across continents, mirroring the family's old strategy of occupying the choke points of trade. The modern world believes these systems emerged naturally through growth and globalization, but in truth, they follow patterns mapped centuries earlier. Another pillar of their legacy lies in information. Asymmetry. The family had mastered the art of gathering intelligence faster than states, allowing them to anticipate collapses and opportunities long before they were publicly visible. Today, vast industries are built around this principle. Financial institutions monitor movements of commodities, currencies, political sentiment, and corporate disclosures with the same urgency that the family once applied to troop movements, crop failures, or diplomatic tensions. The scale has changed, but the Bayaz method remains identical. Even the practice of using projected value as leverage traces back to them. Modern credit markets, derivatives, and speculative financing all rely on the idea that a future asset can be monetized in the present. What was once considered radical, using anticipated profits to fund multiple ventures simultaneously, has become the backbone of global finance. Nations run on borrowed time, corporations run on borrowed cash, and individuals run on borrowed credit, echoing the family's early discovery that wealth can be multiplied when it stops being tied to tangible goods and becomes a function of confidence. Perhaps the most striking continuation of their model is how crisis has become institutionalized. The family prospered because crisis created opportunity, and today's world is structured in similar rhythms. Recessions redistribute power. Market crashes consolidate assets. Debt crises strengthen certain institutions while weakening others. None of this unfolds spontaneously. It reflects a systemic logic that rewards those who understand where the pressure points lie. In this sense, the family's influence never ended. Their strategies survived by dissolving into the fabric of the modern economy, blending with policy, banking, and global trade until the original architects became invisible. Yet the world still moves according to the patterns they revealed, patterns that continue to decide who rises, who falls, and who quietly profits in every era. Modern history loves its icons of wealth. Oil magnates, industrial titans, tech billionaires, financial prodigies. Each generation selects new figures to symbolize power and prosperity. Yet none of them, not even the most celebrated names, ever reached the kind of structural dominance this earlier family achieved. Their wealth was not measured in visible assets, public companies, or personal empires. It was embedded in systems and dependencies in the invisible architecture of global trade. And because their influence was diffuse rather than centralized, it created a form of power that is nearly impossible to surpass. Oil tycoons, for example, dominated an industry built on a finite resource. Their fortunes soared as long as their wells produced and global demand expanded. But their influence was bounded by geography, by regulation, and by the physical limitations of extraction. Tech billionaires control platforms, algorithms, and networks, yet their power depends on legal frameworks, patent systems, and market access that governments can alter. Even modern financial elites operate under constraints, capital requirements, regulatory oversight, systemic risk, that limit how deeply they can shape global events without exposure. The family who pioneered unlimited wealth faced none of these barriers. They rose in a world where most institutions lacked the sophistication to counter or even comprehend their strategies. They operated across borders long before globalization had a name, slipping through gaps in political authority that no longer exist. They mastered financial leverage before modern banking understood its implications, and they built intelligence networks before states recognized information as a strategic asset. Their innovations were not constrained by precedent. They became the precedent that later generations unknowingly followed. What truly sets them apart, however, is the nature of the system they created. Their wealth was not extracted from a single industry or a region. It grew from the misalignments between empires, from the inefficiencies that governments could not resolve, from the predictable failures of political and economic structures. In every age, there are people who benefit from opportunity. But this family benefited from inevitability. They positioned themselves so precisely within the global machinery that the world's most powerful nations indirectly reinforced their dominance without realizing it. Even today's wealths, icons cannot replicate this kind of reach. Modern markets are faster and more interconnected, but also more transparent. Central banks coordinate policy. Regulators monitor flows of capital. Diplomatic treaties formalize trade relationships. Technology reduces information asymmetry. These guardrails did not exist when the family built their empire, which allowed them to operate with a magnitude of influence that would be nearly impossible to reproduce now. And yet, the imprint of their methods lingers, shaping the paths of those who seek power today. Many modern fortunes mimic pieces of the structure they created, leveraging volatility, exploiting interdependence, controlling infrastructure, or accelerating crisis to unlock opportunity. But none of these fragments add up to the whole. What they built was not a business model. It was a worldview, a system of interpreting global dynamics that transformed uncertainty into the most reliable engine of wealth the world had ever seen. Their legacy is not measured in numbers, but in patterns, and those patterns continue to influence the rise and fall of every wealthy figure who came after them. The most striking part of this family's story is not the scale of their wealth or the reach of their influence, but how effortlessly their framework survived them. Long after their dynasty faded from public awareness, the logic that powered their ascent continued shaping the global economy. Today, when currencies collapse, when trade wars erupt, when markets panic at the slightest tremor, the reactions follow the same script that once fueled the family's rise. And the reason is simple. They identified structural weaknesses that never truly disappeared. Modern institutions patched the symptoms, but kept the architecture intact. Look closely at any major economic crisis of the last century, and you will see echoes of the same dynamics they mastered. When nations accumulate unsustainable debt, when supply chains centralize around fragile choke points, when financial markets become dependent on speculative leverage, the system begins to behave exactly like the world that allowed this family to prosper. The players are different now. Central banks, multinational corporations, sovereign funds. But the vulnerabilities are nearly identical, and those who understand them can predict which sectors will collapse, which assets will surge, and which political narratives will emerge to justify the chaos. This is why their story matters. It reveals that global crises are rarely accidents. They are the natural outcome of incentives built deep into the structure of modern economics. The family discovered that if you position yourself where instability converges, wealth becomes a mathematical outcome rather than a gamble. Today's world, more interconnected and fragile than ever, operates under the same conditions. The only difference is scale. A disruption that once affected a single empire can now ripple across continents in minutes. Understanding these patterns is not merely an exercise in historical curiosity. It is a way of interpreting the present. It explains why some institutions grow stronger during recessions while others crumble. It clarifies why entire nations become trapped in cycles of debt and dependency. And it illuminates why certain individuals and groups seem almost insulated from the crises that devastate everyone else. The family's legacy is not confined to the past. It is alive in every market shock, every currency shift, every political realignment that shapes the world today. If you have followed this story until now, you already understand more about global dynamics than most people ever will. And if this perspective helps you see how the next economic rupture might unfold, then the value of this narrative extends far beyond history. Before we continue exploring these deeper layers in future videos, share your voice. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I'm here until the end," so I know you stayed with me through the full journey. And if this content brings clarity to the world behind the headlines, Make sure you are subscribed and give this video a like so you do not miss what comes next. There is a video right here that expands on the same hidden structures shaping global power today, so follow the thread and continue the story there.